and I've just at the very last minute been asked to moderate the session. And so you must please excuse any fumblings and any little gaps in I'm not the quickest of thinkers. So, and I'm really delighted by this wonderful turnout and more people still coming in. And the lights have gone out, but I was wondering how many of you actually do have a connection with the Himalayas or other mountains? Hands up. Well, there's not that many hands, so it's even nicer that many of you will now have a connect with the mountains. And if I could introduce myself, I'm Namita Gokhale. If you go through the bio notes, I'm a writer, I'm a publisher, and I'm a festival director. I do the Jaipur Literature Festival in Jaipur. I'm one of the 2 co-directors there. But you know, when you go back to what is your main identity, I keep going back to saying I'm a Pahari girl. Of course, I'm not a girl anymore. And I'm not even a Pahari because I've lived in all kinds of places and I hardly go back to the hills. But once you have loved the Himalayan mountains, a bit of them stay with you forever, wherever you go. My 2 co-panelists, like me, they may not have been born, unlike me, in the Himalayas, but they have been reborn in the Himalayas, in the sense that both of them have traveled not only in this sweep of mountains, but across the other mountains across the world. I'm one of those lazy, fumbling old aunties who find it difficult to climb upstairs. So I just drive to the mountains, and what I get in about the mountains is from books, from other people's stories, and from the smell and feel of the Himalayas. Now, as you all probably do know, the Himalayas are the youngest mountain range in the world. They are the only ones that are still growing. Around Delhi you have the Aravalli Mountains, which are the oldest mountain range, I'm told, and they are getting shorter and shorter and more eroded until you don't even notice them. They are just sometimes a bump in the highway now. But the Himalayas are growing, I don't know how many inches, but a certain number of inches every year. And they're thrusting up. They are full of this most vibrant, almost pagan energy. And I believe that every corner of the Himalayas has its own sacred energy of the earth right there. It's been one of my well, not my grouses, but I've always felt that first of all, the Himalayas belong to the world, because they are just they're the roof of the world, the tallest mountains in the world, but they also belong to themselves, that this huge sweep of mountain, it's very sad that along its way, it's defined rather by the hinterlands and the lowlands and the countries that encounter it. I mean, whether it is Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kashmir, India, Sikkim, Bhutan, Nepal, these all have their own Himalayas, but in India, the Punjab defines the Himachal Pradesh, or the prevailing culture of the more commercial lowlands does tend to define the politics and the economics of it, whereas actually they should very well deserve their own economic agenda and their own development agenda and their own cultural identity. And I'm now struck speechless because there is somebody in the front row who knows more about these mountains than many of us do, and that is a very famous writer who has written From Heaven Lake and actually traveled there. So well, it's an age of imposters, Vikram said. So here I am on the stage, and we do hope you will join us and tell us something about your experiences, especially since we are one shot and I'm moderating at the very last minute. I'd love both of you to now explain what you were doing in the Himalayas and what you do plan to do in the Himalayas.
So I'm Gavin Francis. I'm a travel writer, and my 2 books are actually about the polar region. So I wrote a book a few years back about the Arctic, a journey from Iceland, Greenland, Lapland, Svalbard, all those regions of the Arctic north of Europe. And then after I was in the Arctic, I decided that experience of that very simple, very elemental landscape had been so made such a profound impression that I had to see the other extreme, so I had to go to the Antarctic. And so I managed to get a job I'm also a doctor, I should say, sorry. So I got a job as a medical doctor in the Antarctic. And then when I got back from the Antarctic, after a year there, I thought I really want to see the Himalayas. Because there's this tradition which rightly or wrongly seems to link these regions, because they're very simple landscapes, because they're very little vegetation, because they're landscapes constructed entirely from ice and rock. And so when I got back from the Antarctic, I made a trip to the Himalayas, and that's my connection. And I'll talk a little bit later perhaps about my route largely in Ladakh and in the northern areas of Pakistan.
I'm Libby Owen Edmunds. I'm an Australian, so growing up in Australia, our childhood was completely outdoors. The outdoors every weekend, walking, running wild. And of course our highest mountain is Mount Kosciuszko, which is a mere 2,228 metres high, and literally takes an hour and a half to conquer. If you catch the chairlift, maybe 20 minutes. For me, my relationship with the Himalayas really started actually knowing that I was born a mountain goat, that I had to move beyond Australia and explore much bigger ranges. So initially it was all about just intrigue, and as a tourist I headed to Nepal. So that was my first introduction, trekking the Annapurna range in Nepal. But I guess my relationship continued to change and has continued to change with the Himalayas over the last 20 years, from simply wanting to go for that physical challenge of climbing a mountain, really then to moving on for more of a pilgrimage approach through Tibet, Western Tibet, and then moving on through to countries like Bhutan and exploring and beginning to understand mountain communities a little bit more. And for the last 13 years I've been living in South Asia, and I've had plenty of opportunities to explore some of the sub-ranges, the Karakoram range, the Hindu Kush, and other areas within the Himalayas. So my relationship with the Himalayas has changed completely over time, and I think that is also really depends on the point of life, the point at which you ask yourself what are your needs and how you want to interact with the mountains.
Thank you. I think if we sort of begin with your point about conquest and pilgrimage and the spirit in which one approaches high mountains, I think it would be good to begin with the idea of ecology and environment, and whether in these years that you have been traveling, what you have observed about it. Especially it would be good to know about Pakistan as well, and also India, about the quality of the environment and the ecology and what has happened to it. I come from a place called Kumaon in Nainital, in the central Himalayas, and this year on the 14th of May there was a landslide and rains, and thousands and thousands and thousands of people who have still not been counted died in flash floods. And it was one of the greatest tragedies to strike these mountains. And tourists, because it's a pilgrimage place, there were pilgrims from all across India who were there, who died under the most tragic circumstances, and very little has been done really to rebuild the ecology. And I would say that a lot of the tragedy in our end of the mountains came from the greed of contractors who were mining cement and sand and cutting away the forests. And so there is, I mean, a direct assault on the Himalayas where I have encountered it, and an almost criminal plundering of the Himalayas. But I'd like to know from both of you your encounters with these issues.
I think it's interesting, your first point, Nauta, about the idea of conquest in terms of exploring the mountains versus the idea of pilgrimage. And we were just chatting outside. I'm delighted that that I'm the only man on the stage here. Usually in the UK, discussions of the Himalayas are usually very kind of frosted, bearded explorer types who are talking very much of the mountains in the sense of conquest, of wanting to reach the summits of them, and they don't have a lot of interest. If you read that literature, that mountaineering literature, there's very little interest shown in the valleys beneath the mountains and the differences in culture, say, between Nepal or Himachal Pradesh or the northern areas of Pakistan. And the tradition of pilgrimage in the mountains obviously is much, much older, and it's something I don't feel particularly well qualified to talk about. I'm delighted that others will be able to talk about it in a more informed way than I. Coming to your point about the ecology, from the mountaineering perspective, I think it's well recognised now that we've had 50 years of mountaineering expeditions in the Himalayas that have shown very little regard for the pristine nature of that beautiful landscape. And so there are now expeditions to the Everest region and also to the K2 region, Baltoro and Glacier and so on, who are only interested in trying to clear up the mess left by others. Oxygen tanks, the enormous amounts of aluminium food packaging that's been left littering the place. And that's a very welcome development. In terms of the pace of development and sometimes the lack of integrity among the developers, yeah, it's certainly something that travelling both in the northern areas, but more so, I have to say, more so in India and Nepal, you can see the effects of very cheaply put up buildings that are not really made to survive heavy rains or thaws. And we could move on, I suppose, to talk about how much of this is just a freak episode and how much is related to changes to do with climate change, but for that I'm happy to be informed as well by others.
I think my observation, certainly, if I start with somewhere like Western Tibet, which the mountain Mount Kailash, which is the holy mountain for Bon Buddhists, Jains and Hindus. That's where I went on a pilgrimage probably about 8 years ago now. And in terms of bringing in the environmental aspect to it, in addition to kind of melting glaciers, you don't actually see so much of that because you're so high up on the plateau itself. So these incredibly high mountains just feel like small hills because you're traveling at an average of 4,000, 5,000 meters anyway. But in terms of the environment and scarring the landscape, obviously the Chinese have had a huge impact in the west of Tibet. And of course, everything you read about the west, well, everything that I had read about the west of Tibet, you know, basically I thought there wouldn't be a building, a road, that I'd probably have to jump on the back of a horse to get to Mount Kailash, or just continue to walk for months and months. But unfortunately, the Chinese are in the process of putting a railway line all the way through to Mount Kailash, this holy mountain, for their billion population to have easy access. Not only that, this beautiful landscape was completely scarred with just cement toilet block buildings dispersed in between beautiful yurts and gers of the nomads. So from in Tibet, the environment, and then obviously there's all these, because the road and train and the accessibility has been opened up, there's the whole plastic bottle rubbish issue, which is just endless, I think, these days in any mountains, no matter where you are. In the north of Pakistan, definitely climate change is having a huge impact on mountain communities with flash flooding, landslides, and I've seen this particularly in the Mashabrum ranges, which in the Hushi Valley, actually sometimes twice a year, whole villages are completely and utterly destroyed without any forewarning whatsoever. And there are a number of NGOs who are working on the whole impact of climate change up there, but a lot more needs to be done with glaciers melting and these flash floods happening.
So would you say that perhaps there was some sense in declaring the mountains sacred? It was one way of keeping them to themselves. And I know that Bhutan, I do an annual literature festival in Bhutan, and I know that they have a very thoughtful, mindful attitude to the environment. They have a whole system of Buddhist environmental studies, and they seem to have taken the better route in keeping their mountains clean. But down the rivers, it's the same there. I thought maybe this might be a good time to ask you to just show a little bit of the PowerPoint so that we actually see and remember these mountains we are talking about so far away from Lahore. And I was wondering, I'm making a public request to Vikram, that maybe he'll come up and say a few words about the mountains. To us, it would be, look at if you do. At the podium. I mean, it's a heartfelt request from all of us. Maybe he'll go to the podium? Or...
Will I go to the podium? Yeah.
No, first, the Vikram has come up.
Her ranges over there. Well, thank you, but I'm just winging it now. I don't really have any expertise in terms of knowledge, particular knowledge about the Himalayas. I perhaps should, but clearly, in a sense, it defines India as it was then, the subcontinent as it is now, and not only us on this side, but also the Chinese and the Tibetans on the other. In a funny way, because of the Himalaya, although China and India are so proximate, everyone, except for a few intrepid travelers like Fa Xian and Xuanzang and so on, and monks in general and some traders, has really taken the long way around, the sea route through the Malacca Straits and then up across around the tip of Vietnam and so on. I studied in China for 2 years, between 1980 and 1982, as a student of economics, which is what I was, but I never finished my PhD, so I remained what was called an ABD, an all but dissertation. I studied in Nanjing University, which is as far from the Himalayas as you could possibly imagine. It's about six hours by train from Shanghai on the Changjiang, the Yangtze River. Now, what happened was that we would travel everywhere. It took me a long time to get permission to do research, China being pretty bureaucratic in those days and also quite reluctant to let foreigners into their villages to find out what the demographic and other changes as well. So I happened to be in the northwest of China, in Xinjiang, just traveling, when it struck me that there may be a possibility to get on my travel pass, because you needed this travel pass. It's an internal travel document. You go from place to place in China in those days. There might be a possibility to, since I hadn't been able to get Lhasa anywhere by pleading by any means, perhaps in this obscure, in those days, Urumqi, I might possibly be able to get this magical stamp. And through various things, including singing a song, I did manage to get it. Then the question was going southwards. Well, there were tremendous floods that year, 1981, all over the northwest of China, and I didn't know this. Nor did I know that the so-called friendship bridge between China, or Tibet I should say, and Nepal had been washed away. Had I known that, and this is one of the advantages of ignorance, had I known that, I would certainly not have started out on the journey. But I used my thumb and got my Chinese, because I spoke Chinese, and then the fact that I could pass, perhaps, as what they call a minority, a Xiaoshu Minzu, being sort of short and at that time quite dark, and my blue Chinese clothes, and my odd Chinese accent. So that's how I slowly went down further and further south. But I was ignorant when I went. I didn't even have my passport with me. I had to rush back to Nanjing all the way from the northwest to get my passport. I told my parents I'm coming on such and such flight from Hong Kong, and I didn't really have any way, except very elliptically, of telling them that I wouldn't be on that flight. Naturally, they were worried. Down I came south, got to Lhasa, finally crossed the Himalaya, But certainly what Libby says, that is, things don't look so dramatic from up there. If you're already at 4,500 meters, seeing something like Gosaipan or something like that, well, okay, yeah. But from this side, of course, they look enormously dramatic. Now let me jump a few years to last week, or 2 weeks ago. One of the things I love doing is going to Nepal in the winter. Because although it's terribly cold, and if you don't bring your hot water bottle with you, you'll be uncomfortable, the skies are so clear, and the place that I was staying, you could see everything from the Ganesh Himal all the way on a clear day to Everest. And in fact, there's a particular place there called Daman, where you can see everything all the way from Annapurna, Dholagiri, that sort of area, across to Manastu, and then across all the way to Everest. So that is the best view in Nepal, which actually means it's the best mountain view in the world. Daman is the place. It's on the old highway going south from Kathmandu.
Can I ask you
Sure.
about reflections you might or may not have on the differences and the similarities between the Chinese perspective on the Massif, the Trans-Himalaya, versus the subcontinent perspectives in terms of do the Chinese have traditions of thinking of pilgrimages there, of them as a very sacred landscape, in the same way that in the subcontinent the perspectives are very much of the Himalayas as a sacred landscape, separated beyond, a sort of apart from normal life?
I don't think that the same general view prevails there. It is true that in the Buddhist image of the journey to the West, which is quite a common trope in Chinese literature and Chinese Buddhist religion, there is that aspect, but it is a more generalized West. I don't think the idea of the mountains, the Himalayan mountains, mean quite as much to them as their own particular sacred mountains within the main body of China, like Huangshan, for example, or Ermeishan. Well, Ermeishan is almost on the borders of the Himalaya, you might say, but there are other mountains, Lushan, Huangshan, Huashan, and so on. So these mountains have meant a great deal to them. Remember that most of the population of China is really the Han Chinese. Perhaps 94% of the population are actually concentrated on about 40-45% of the land. And so for them, in a sense, what happens up there, Tibet and Xinjiang and so on, the very word Xinjiang, although it's a 2,000-year-old province of China, Xinjiang simply means new boundary. Rather like the New Forest, which of course in England is a pretty old forest, was something new 1,000 years ago. So this doesn't enter their consciousness in quite the same way as it does ours. And I would say that even the word Himalaya, Shan, is of course a phonetic transliteration into Chinese of Himalaya, which for us is, as from the Sanskrit Himalaya, the snow, ice place, home. Alaya just means where it is, like a pustakala would be a library. So that's it, a very actually ordinary, simple name, now invested with this huge associational weight. But I don't think the Chinese feel anything in those terms like we do. Now in terms of strategic importance, looking down in a sense upon another country from a place where road, railway, very important for them. And that was of course part of the reason for the takeover of Tibet, or not necessarily the takeover, as they see it, the reincorporation of Tibet into China. It's a very vexed issue, this whole thing, and I think both sides have behaved with a kind of idiocy in this matter. And I would say we didn't cover ourselves with glory by either our alertness or our comprehension of what the arguments on the other side, the reasonable arguments on the other side were, without obviously losing the reasonable arguments on ours.
So, about the sacred thing, in India I think one of the problems is that it is the abode of Lord Shiva and it is a very, very sacred place. And ironically it is the sacred status which is leading to a lot of very greedy pilgrimages that are quickly destroying as quickly as the Chinese side may be. But about the mountains, maybe it's time now to see his PowerPoint and then continue this conversation. Vikram, please sit
One
here.
quick point
Yeah.
about, it just suddenly struck me, of course, all the great rivers, the Salween, the Mekong, the Brahmaputra,
Yes.
the Indus, the Satluj, are all pretty much concentrated in their headwaters in that area. So there are all sorts of other aspects which come into play
Yes.
when we consider the crucial, strategic and environmental importance of
The rivers are, of course, the main point, and the damming
Yeah.
of the rivers, and
True.
which we have to remember. Even Lord Shiva, the great Indian god, the Ganga is flowing from his
Jataju.
hair, which is one of the great things, which obviously was some engineering feat long ago, is that Lord Bhagirath, God brought the Ganga down, so maybe they moved it around a little bit. And it's also very interesting that all the rivers are feminine, except for the Brahmaputra, which is the only masculine river. And I wonder if it is feminine and masculine in their vocabulary also.
Chinese doesn't have a feminine and masculine at
Okay.
all. It's not a grammatical category that exists, which of course helps you when you learn Chinese. By the way, talk of feminine and masculine, I see we're now both more balanced racially and in terms of gender.
But earlier we were very well balanced, because at least in my part of the hills, it's well known that the women do all the work. The men sit and have some chai and some cigarettes. And around the mountains, I've done literature festivals around a lot of the mountains with the idea of understanding common food habits and music traditions, and it is all in the same flow, more or less. And one more thing that is common across the mountains is that the women are very, very tough. They are not in parda, they are just sort of fighting tigers, getting the water, throwing stones at sort of wolves running away. And now let's evoke the mountains, and let's get back to this very interesting conversation and get some back from the audience.
I'd be interested.
Watch this.
I'd be interested to hear what you said, Namita, about the. Isn't there a very, very old Vedic perspective on the Himalayas being called the abode of women? I've read about that somewhere a long
We can
time
ascribe
ago.
anything to the Vedas.
Okay, fine. So no, this is a very, very quick perspective on the Himalayas, and Libby is going to talk more about, I think, the contemporary perspective on travelling. But when I travel, I seem to be constantly imagining myself 2,000 years past or 1,000 years past. So I'm going to try and give a bit more of the historical perspective. So very quickly, this is where I come from, a very alien landscape to this. So just before we, I want to emphasise that I am very much a foreigner here. This is Edinburgh, and so I grew up in a landscape much more like this, very cold, windy, sea. But when I decided to start leaving Scotland and start travelling, the first place I went was the Arctic, north from Scotland, which is very close to us, very, very easy to get into the Arctic. This is Greenland. And when I got back from Greenland, as I mentioned briefly, I took a ship to the Antarctic because I wanted to see the opposite extreme, down towards the South Pole. So I headed down to there to work in a station on the Antarctic ice sheet. And this is an image of the base where I lived for a year, with the supply ship coming in. So a very simple, very pure, only ice and sky, not even rocks in that part of the Antarctic. The rocks are many thousands of miles away from there. Just, you live on ice, and it gets very cold. This is a minus 55 degrees where you wear a neoprene face mask, and then a balaclava, and then a rabbit fur hat, and then all your gear. So when I got back from my time in the Antarctic, oh sorry, that's a book I wrote about the Antarctic, of course, never miss an opportunity. When I got back from the Antarctic, I decided with my wife I wanted to go to the Himalayas, and she wanted to go too. So we set off, we decided to do it overland. So we drove from Scotland down towards Turkey, that's the route to Istanbul, down through Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. We couldn't get a visa for Iran, so we had to get to Jordan. Then of course we couldn't get a Saudi transit visa, so we had to do this kind of absurd bit with some of our stuff going by land to Dubai and then to Karachi, and some of our stuff going by sea, and we flew. So that's how I got to Pakistan, to begin exploring the Himalayas. And the first bit I want to talk about, I'm going to do it slightly backwards, is start at Punjab, up in the northern areas. Now that is the Punjab Pass, with a yak there in the foreground, where the Himalayas become very much rounder and softer. They're no longer the sharp, scree slopes that we're used to further south in Hunza. And from my perspective as a travel writer interested in history, Punjab region is very interesting because it could be the first mention in the west of the Himalayas. It's thought, some anthropologists believe that Herodotus, the 6th century, 5th century BC Greek historian, wrote about this region. That's Herodotus, supposedly. In his histories, his famous histories describe this region far in the east, beyond Persia, where there were these creatures which dig gold out of the earth when they're scrubbing around in the earth. And it's thought that he was describing marmots, because there's a lot of gold, as you know, around Rakapush and Gilgit and up towards Punjab. And it's thought that he was describing them pulling gold up out of the earth from their burrows. So from Punjab, I'm travelling south down now through the Karakoram Highway into Hunza. And Vikram mentioned earlier the input from the Chinese. As a foreigners, the West and Europe goes silent for centuries and centuries. But the Chinese were travelling through this region a great deal, Faxin and Xinjiang, and they describe very beautifully this landscape of vertical cliffs, constant landslides, but they describe it in terms of dragons, that there are dragons living in these mountains, and the dragons are constantly causing these landslides, and also the dragons are in the river, in the Indus. And so Xinjiang in particular describes how it's a very dangerous river to cross, especially if you try and cross it with sacred scriptures, because they believed very much that the Buddhist scriptures were not allowed to leave the subcontinent, and it was very difficult to take them across the water. The next time it comes up in the West, this is a beautiful map made just before the discovery of the New World. This is a 15th century Venetian map of the world. And here, this is, if you look very closely in this region, if you get a copy of the real map, you will see this beautiful description of the Indus, just as it comes down near Peshawar. The Venetian friar writes, here there is a very noble bridge which crosses the Indus. This is the way to travel between India and China. And so that was done in about 1450. So this is my wife and I crossing over the Wagah border over into the Indian side. And I'm just finishing off now, but I'm just going to describe very briefly two more travellers really who are also foreigners who've written about this region into the foothills. Well, that's not a very good slide. That's a slide of the Kashmir survey done by the British. But there was a Hungarian chap, a guy called Soma de Kouros, or Koros, who was a Hungarian nationalist who was obsessed with Tibet. And he travelled up into Ladakh in the early 19th century, up this way. This is the road up into Ladakh through Zanskar. And also Kipling, of course, and we've discussed Kipling. Kipling's been mentioned at a few of the sessions I've attended here in this festival. Obviously, Kipling has a very strong connection with Lahore, and there's a lot of mixed feelings about him now because of his extremely imperialistic perspective on India. But he also wrote very beautifully about the Himalayas, and in Kim he describes the whole region of Lahore and Spiti very beautifully, which is this region here, as the old monk and Kim themselves try and travel up towards Leh, and this is Leh. So I'm just, my connection, as I mentioned briefly at the beginning, is that I'm a travel writer largely about the polar regions, but I did write an essay about Ladakh, which is partly why I think I've been asked to contribute to this panel. And so I'll just finish off. That's my essay about Ladakh. And I love these, in India, I love these road signs you get everywhere throughout the Ladakhi highlands. Heaven, hell, or Mother Earth, the choice is yours. So Ladakh is very much, it is a type of heaven, I think. It's got that sense of separateness from the rest of the planet that we get in the Arctic or that we get in the Antarctic. And I was very fortunate to experience it. Thank you. Switch that off now, please.
Thank you on behalf of all the audience for that really wonderful evocation of the mountains. And Choma, in fact, was the person who came, as I understand it, in search of the Hungarian roots of the Hungarian language, because he thought it was not part of the Finnish, Uralic, whatever. And he did the first dictionary of Tibetan languages. You know, Vikram, in the Jaipur Festival this year we had a session on losing Himalayan languages, and it was really a very tragic, depressing session, because mountain communities are isolated from each other and they are depleting. And so I don't know what it is in this part of the world, but across India and Nepal and also Bhutan, we are losing so many languages, and there's such a loss of culture, and it's really sad. Where I come from in Nainital, Kumaon, there's a whole range of poetry which I want to tell Vikram about, which is associated with how it is sung. It is called a Neoli. And a Neoli is a poem which is sung like that, because you sing only for yourself. You sing on top of a mountain, and you sing it to yourself, and you hope that somewhere it will echo to the next mountain, and some beautiful girl will hear it, and well, she can't meet you, sadly. So that...
Any hope of a demonstration?
You would have to do that. And the amusical person.
Can I just yes, add to that? With all the travelling I've done in the north of Pakistan, when you're talking about loss of languages, one of the areas that I've actually written about the history and culture on in northern Pakistan is the area of Baltistan, which used to be called Little Tibet. In the late 90s, UNESCO put the Balti language, which is it's a dialect of the Tibetan language, as one of the languages which was about to become extinct. And of course, language for them is so important because of oral traditions, as you were saying. So not the written is as there, but as actually the oral is much more important than the written word. So and one of the reasons why the language of Balti is being lost is because, firstly, 500 years ago it was cut off from Tibet. Also, in the 15th century, when that area was converted from Buddhism to Islam, languages like Persian and Urdu became much more popular. So in Pakistan, it is very important that all of us who are interested in culture pay attention to these things, because before we know it, they'll slip by, and we'll lose those traditions.
And of course, with every loss of language, you lose so much accumulated knowledge, biological knowledge, geographical knowledge, geological knowledge, health knowledge. So it's really tragic, and it's very important to archive it. All these are moralistic things. But, you know, across the mountains, I found there is, Vikram maybe will be able to tell us more about it, but there's like Rag Pahari is the particular musical tradition which in some form or the other you encounter everywhere, and the flute is the instrument of choice almost across the mountains. Just as archery for some reason is the sport. But if you could tell us about Rag Pahari and why, if you know anything, I mean, since you know more about it.
Pahari, actually there are a number of rags which are quite common in the mountains, but I think for some reason we on the plains have called a particular rag, I think it's in the Balaka, Rag Pahari. I think the flute and other wind instruments, it's natural that they should be used over there, because I think it carries. For a start, from valley to valley, and even those deeper bass register Tibetan, that you see in Tintin, for example, Tintin in Tibet.
That's very bad. Can you continue?
Well, anyway, and as far as archery is concerned, again, I suspect it's because, food sources and food supplies, I mean, it would kind of be the case. What I found quite interesting also, and this is something which, talking about mountain areas, when I was in Bolivia, I found very great similarities, for example, in dress between the people over there in the Andes, in the upper reaches of the Andes, and those in the Himalayas. And I thought, well, I wonder, but of course, there is no secret to it. It's because the materials available, the kinds of styles, the need to protect yourself from the cold in a certain way, and to keep certain extremities looking not like that. Was that you? Hannibal Lecter? Yeah, picture. Yeah, so there's certain obvious things that the commonalities are not historical linkages so much as
What Gavin was wearing was actually the style of it's called a Bengali monkey cap. If for some reason people around Calcutta and Bengal in India, they feel cold very quickly, and the minute they reach about 1,000 feet, they wear something rather like that. But the loss of culture and all apart, the whole mapping of the Himalayas and the understanding of the heights and the geography, I've been working just now on a book, not working on a book, but I've done an essay in my latest book on somebody called Nain Singh Rawat, who actually was on behalf of the trigonometrical survey of, because it was the hot political scene of the Great Game, so they wanted to know every bit of the geography, and so these people used to go as spies, disguised in their lama clothes, and they had prayer beads with 100 beads instead of 108, and 100 beads was 100 feet, which was then measured, and they'd have, it's all a very exciting sort of history. But would you like to add to that, Gavin?
I was interested in what you're saying about the rivers as well, the fascination with the rivers and the sacred aspect of the rivers traditionally. And I read a statistic somewhere that was talking about the rivers Vikram was mentioning earlier, the Yellow River, the Yangtze, the Ganges, Brahmaputra, the Indus, and supposedly more than half of humanity live along the drainage basins of these rivers. And I'm curious if any of the other panelists had reflections on how much the political fascination with this landscape, whether it's Chinese or Tibetan or Indian, Pakistani, how much of it is strategic and how much of it is about water security? Because because the rivers that come off the Tibetan plateau are so vital.
I think it's definitely a combination. I mean, if you look at the nomads up in Ladakh, for example, in the Zanskar Valley, they're all coming down in the summer to access water, particularly in such desolate landscapes where in the winter there's no water whatsoever. So there's this transitory relationship with the nomads and living along and grazing along the river systems. Did you want to?
No, go ahead.
In the north of Pakistan, as I said, in Baltistan, actually, it was strategic because going along the rivers was the only way you could get and start your wars between royal families and those type of areas. It was because the mountain ranges were far too high and far too dangerous to actually get across. So what they used to do was on yak skins, float across on rafts, and of course a lot of loss of life as well. But that was the only way of travelling through, was following the river system.
True, but according to me, the water security is getting more and more important. It's becoming the great political issue between India and China now, and will only get worse. And India and Pakistan.
And Bangladesh. But of course, I mean, that's not a Himalayan question.
Yeah, but the same rivers as they go down.
Yeah.
So I think we have about 15 minutes left. We could make some closing remarks, and then not closing, but we could just sort of pick up some more points of view and just remember, since this is such an impromptu session, It doesn't have to have any structural relationship, what we say to each other. We could have 4 mountain peak conversations, and then we could open it to the audience, because I'm sure many of them will have questions, observations, memories to share. But in about the trade, I'm sorry, I can only give my own personal perspectives, because I have such a dearth of larger perspectives here. But in our part of the mountains, when the British first came, they said this is richer than any European country. And the reason for that was it was the thriving center of the Tibet trade and across the passes. And what you said about gold mining, there was a lot along the Sona River, gold panning, gold mining. And we grew up getting these hunis, which were the Hunias, the Huns from China coming and trading, and there was salt, borax, wool. And there were villages where they kept insulated for danger of epidemics, and there used to be these sort of broken stones. There'd be a half a stone with one side and half a stone with the other trading partner. And they would then exchange those to show that and carry their accounts forward like that. And then in 1962, there was the Indo-Pakistan, the Indo-China war, and the trade stopped. And when that trade stopped, the entire economy along Kumaon collapsed, and led to a lot of bad things, led to a lot of local alcoholism, led to a lot of trouble and loss of, because what used to be a traditional source of living for years and years was gone. But that's my parting sort of sad thing, apart from a line from a poem by, I think Blake, I may be wrong, which says, "Great things are done when men and mountains meet. This is not done by something in the street." But of course, men, women, gender equity. What do you want to say, any of you, last memories of invoking these great mountains which we just saw here?
I meet so many Pakistanis who have never ventured further north than perhaps Islamabad or Peshawar. And the north of your country is absolutely spectacular. And in many ways, there are probably 3 different countries up there in those mountain ranges, with Baltistan, as I said, the language is Tibetan, the architecture is Tibetan, the food is Tibetan. It's just that in the 14th and 15th century it was converted to Islam. And if you take areas like Hunza, which are a large Ismaili community, very different landscape to Baltistan again, and very, very beautiful. With also a lot of traditions and things like that breaking down, purely because of the opening of the Karakoram Highway in the late 80s. Those areas were completely isolated for so many years that their culture was preserved. But in the last 20 years, so much has been destroyed just purely because of a simple road. Giving people access, bringing water, electricity. So on one hand it's positive, but there's also negative impacts of this.
My last closing remarks really are about growing up in Scotland, a place very, very far away from here, where, like many of you, I'm sure, I used to do a lot of travelling through the Atlas. And I'd spend hours in the public library with their great big atlas, looking at all the places I would one day like to visit. And when you flick through the atlas, it really strikes you that there's only one place in the world which is as broad, expansive, as clean, if you like, as empty of settlements so far, and empty of roads and development as the Himalayan, the Trans-Himalaya, the Tibetan Plateau. And it jumps out at you from the pages that this region, along with the polar regions, are really something very special and something we have to take good care of. And there's been too much written by people from Europe like me trying to say how things should be done elsewhere in the world. But it's just now, as a visitor, I can see this place and visit it and cherish it and be grateful for people in this part of the world to allow me to visit and travel in it. So, thank you.
Vikram?
Well, I was giving
You always get the last one.
I thought that was the last word. My school days were spent in the foothills of the Himalayas, and so obviously they're very dear to me. have just been kidnapped by Namita off the floor, so I have no opening remarks. And perhaps my closing remarks will simply be to replicate what you just said about the breadth, the expanse, the emptiness, and therefore perhaps the very last word should be silence.
Indeed, so honoring the Himalayas. How much time do we have for questions? It's only 5. We have 5 minutes for any questions. There's one there. Is there a mic?
Just an observation about the environmental degradation that has gone on. One was saddened to hear that a railway line is being put across the plateau to take you to the sacred mountain. The quickest way, I think, of destroying the pristine beauty of these mountains is to construct a road leading to wherever. I want to add that 2 places in the Kashmir Valley, Pahalgam and Pahalgam, for instance, the British administration was conscious enough to know that the only way to preserve Pahalgam, which is otherwise an angler's paradise, is to not allow any building to be built in Pahalgam. Anyone who wants to go fishing should carry his tent, go pitch his tent and fish. So it remained pristine until a road leading to Pahalgam was built, and now there are hotels all over the place.
Indeed.
And anybody with a fat wallet and a fat stomach can easily go. So
I think
yeah.
very right. You were getting some claps for the fat wallets and the fat stomach. But Pahalgam is part of that, I think, Amarnath Yatra thing, and that kind of pilgrim tourism is really very negative. Any other questions or comments? Anyway, yeah, here there's, and there. We'll just take these 2 and then close it.
What up there?
If there's time. Depending on.
My question is for Gavin Francis. I haven't read your book, but it intrigued me, the way you mentioned that Herodotus talked about gold in the Himalayas, and the Chinese represented the landscape in terms of dragons. I want to ask you, as a 21st century travel writer, how would you represent this landscape?
I think you'd need to give me 100,000 words just to begin with. Yeah, it's very difficult. I think we're entering a new phase of travel writing, really, particularly from the European perspective about the region. There was I think we're undergoing this wonderful sort of revival, renaissance, this explosion of interest in the subcontinent, in literary experimentation by writers from the subcontinent. And so I feel I'm at an interesting point as a foreigner trying to write about this region. Some of the most interesting books I've read recently about the subcontinent by foreigners actually just remove themselves entirely from the narrative. So, for example, there was a wonderful book came out a couple of years ago by Catherine Wu about Mumbai, about the slums in Mumbai. And if you read that book very carefully, it's called Behind the Beautiful Forever. If you read that book, there's no mention of her anywhere in it. You'd think she's like, she's completely excised herself from the narrative. And so that's a way I would like to be able to write about the Himalayas, but it's difficult.
Vikram, you want to say something?
No, sorry.
Do we take the mountain first or the valley first?
I just have a very brief question.
Okay, mountains.
It won't take long. There are many people who are fascinated by mountains, but they never got around to actually venturing into actually sort of braving themselves to actually go into the mountains. So what sort of starting point tips would you give to a novice or or a person who's just starting out who's fascinated?
Clearly this question is not aimed at me.
Yeah.
I definitely just go, and I mean, look, don't be afraid of the mountains. There's nothing to be afraid of, and I guess anywhere that you can access easily, there is infrastructure there for your safety, for home comforts, whatever. I mean, the Aga Khan Trust for Culture in the north of Pakistan have restored 2 old forts and palaces, which are absolutely beautiful, in Shigar and Kaplu, in isolated villages, surrounded by incredible mountains. So you can have very different experiences in the mountains depending on how you want to, what you want to take from it. Is it history? Is it culture? Is it physical? Is it trekking? Is it climbing?
What if it's sort of like a pilgrimage that you're aiming for?
So, well, it depends where your pilgrimage is, of course. I mean, my biggest pilgrimage was to Mount Kailash, and to get there can take up to 3 weeks, just the journey getting there, and that's by vehicle. And of course, you're traveling at very high altitude, so you need to ensure that you have acclimatized yourself, that you have plenty of warm clothing, all those type of things. But as I said, it really depends on what your need is, and if it is a pilgrimage, then I suggest you start reading and doing some research yourself, reading some great books, and then and just go. I mean, when I went, actually, I didn't actually want to read too much about what I was to get out of this pilgrimage, because I didn't want it to be prescribed. I didn't want to know that at this point I was supposed to be reborn, and at that point I had to cut my hair and take off my clothes. I just wanted it to be my own journey. So it depends exactly how you want to interact, really, how you prepare yourself.
There was the last question? Yeah.
My question is to the panelists. There are 2 things. One is the poverty in these regions. For example, the poor porters who are being used, for example, happened to the Cape Base Camp. So they are being exploited by the different expeditions.
Yes.
And then the question is the preserving of the culture, the
Yes.
commercialization versus if you attend to their poverty, the commercialization is there. So the culture is being affected. How to tackle these 2 opposing things?
Well, I'd like to sort of very quickly respond to that before asking others. I think the answer is that across the Himalayas we have a clear development policy, which is prescriptive but which is not binding, which looks at the particular sort of vocations, professional training, and also making the delinking from the low-end tourism thing. And because what you have said is basically looking for making the people there dependent on tourism, and that is always a demeaning and self-defeating thing. If you look for very specialized sort of tourism and don't depend on tourism as a living, but rather as a way of communicating with the outside world, and use the other ways of preserving that place, which is really the obligation of the rest of the world, to preserve these high climate places, and there should be a cess on or some kind of levy on the rest of the world to really look after the Himalayas. It's a world legacy.
This is an area I've done a lot of work in, which is about communities owning tourism and looking at tourism as a complementary livelihood to their existing livelihood. Because what you find, again, is that if you take them away from the fields and put them into hotels, actually you're breaking down the family unit and traditions again. And also, I mean, look what's happened to Pakistan in terms of tourism. It relied heavily on international tourism for so long, and all of a sudden, bang, there's no tourists coming here, and what you have is all these people who only know tourism. They actually forgot how to farm and do all these other things that were their traditional livelihoods. So a way around that is getting the community to take ownership and let them drive and take the future of tourism into their own hands.
Any further thoughts on that?
Not for me.
Gavin?
I have a quick question for Gavin. Assalamu alaikum. I'm a young doctor myself and quite fond of traveling to cold, high places. I was wondering how you got into traveling to these kind of places, and how you would recommend I would get into it possibly.
That would have to be very quick.
Very, very quickly, do lots of emergency medicine, learn lots of altitude medicine, and then write lots of letters to people saying that you want to come with them.
Well, I think a big clap for the high cool creatures in the world.